and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, this special 5th anniversary episode, we are going to be investigating one of Wales's most iconic, supposedly haunted places. It's a place I know very well myself, and that is the fairy tale home of the most famous opera singer on the planet during her lifetime, and whose home, since her passing, has become one of the most famous haunted houses on the planet. And that is Craig-y-Nos Castle in the Swansea Valley. Also, as this is the 5-year anniversary episode, 5 long years of Wales's first and finest Ghosts and Folklore podcast, I'll be reflecting on that journey a little bit at the end, and I have some exciting news for my American listeners coming up. I have exciting news for all my listeners, but especially my American listeners. But before we get to any of that, we have the small matter of a ghost story to tell. And so, to begin at the beginning. And Craig-y-Nos Castle is one of those places that is so well known. It's so famous. All of the big ghost hunting shows have been there over the years, that for 5 years I didn't feel the need to record an episode about it. I like to focus on the more obscure stuff. What could I add to this story? Well, as it turns out, there's quite a lot I can add to this story. And a bit like with the Markham Castle episode I recorded for Halloween, it's one of those places I've avoided until now just because everyone else is doing it. But for this anniversary episode, I did ask for some questions, and some of the most popular questions were along the lines of, what is the best place in Wales to go investigating? What is your favourite place for ghost hunting in Wales? Where would you recommend? And again, it brought me back to Craig-y-Nos Castle, and that was all the excuse I needed to finally record this episode. And in this episode, we'll start by taking a quick look at the history of the location, then the reports of hauntings over the years, and finally my personal recollections, because it is one of those places, it's just down the road from where I live, that I've spent a lot of time over the years, and I have a lot of stories to tell. And what I think I really love about Craig-y-Nos is that besides all the supposed hauntings and the ghost stories, of which there are many, it's an incredible place culturally, architecturally, artistically, and as long-term listeners will know, my passion, besides ghosts and folklore of course, is the arts. This is as much a place for an arts lover as a ghost hunter. And while this is the Ghosts and Folklore podcast, and I will stick to the Ghosts and Folklore, if I had a separate arts podcast, and maybe that'll happen one day, I could write an equally long episode all about the artistic treasures of Craig-y-Nos Castle. And again, much like Markham Castle, another place I love by the way if you haven't gathered, much like Markham Castle, Craig-y-Nos Castle isn't really a castle. It's a big, fancy mansion that rich Victorians like to call their castle. My home is my castle, as the saying goes. In the case of Markham Castle, it was the Talbot family. In the case of Craig-y-Nos Castle, which incidentally in English means Rock of the Night, a wonderfully evocative name, Rock of the Night. In the case of Craig-y-Nos Castle, it was the opera superstar Adelina Patti. And Adelina Patti is a fascinating character who, unsurprisingly, is the main culprit for most of the paranormal activity reported there. If something unusual happens in Craig-y-Nos, who are you gonna blame? Adelina Patti, and in some cases there might be good reason for this. But in other cases, it's just natural to blame the most famous person attached to the property. You might see this, for example, with somewhere supposedly haunted by Anne Boleyn, because she spent the night there on one occasion, and she is the most famous person associated with it. In Craig-y-Nos, if something's a bit spooky, it's probably Patti, and she was a fascinating character when she was alive, and possibly when she's dead, but certainly when she was alive. Patti was the original diva. She was born in Spain to Italian parents who moved around quite a lot, so pinning down her nationality is a little bit tricky. But she moved to Wales in 1878. And the reason she chose Wales is because she was one of the most famous people on the planet at the time. And I'm not just lightly throwing around the word famous here. She was a superstar. She was invited to the White House by Abraham Lincoln and his wife to sing her trademark song, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And she's even said to have drawn Queen Victoria out of mourning for Prince Albert, which I am sure was quite a challenge, but she came out of mourning to hear Patti singing just to find out what all the fuss was about. And within the music world, some of the biggest composers, even if you aren't an opera fan, I'm sure you are familiar with names like Verdi and Rossini. These Italian greats were writing with Patti in mind. Rossini in particular, who will also pop up again later on. Now, just like in the 21st century, fame had its upsides and its downsides, at least so we're told. I don't know from personal experience, but there was a good side and a bad side to fame. And one of those downsides is the paparazzi. And Patti was one of the first people to be truly hounded by the press. And it didn't help matters that I think it's fair to say her private life was not squeaky clean, which just added fuel to the fire. She was in the gossip pages, she was married, but there was talk that maybe she was spending a little bit too much time with a young tenor called Ernesto Nicolini, who incidentally is also blamed for some of the haunting in Craig-y-Nos today, but yet again, we'll come to that later. But as a result, Patti and this young French tenor needed somewhere secluded, quiet, and out of the way to live, far away from the prying eyes of the press. And from the moment she first cast eyes on this estate in the Swansea Valley, it was love at first sight. Dating from the 1840s, it was the perfect fixer-upper. So she snapped it up and transformed it into this fairy tale Victorian Gothic mansion that we see today, standing tall on Brecon Road in Pennachi, Powys. In fact, she loved it so much she stayed there for the rest of her life until she died in 1919. And her spirit still haunts the place today, certainly in a metaphorical sense. You can feel her in the art and the architecture in and around the building, and some would say in a literal sense as well. Now, that's the more historical part of the episode out of the way. What about these hauntings? And one of the most haunted parts of this entire estate is something that Patti herself had built there. This is one of Patti's own additions, own inventions. And I mentioned that Patti totally transformed this space, but to put things into perspective, she was having guests like the Prince of Wales visit Craig-y-Nos, and rather than have them wind their way through the Swansea Valley countryside, she had a train station built to make it easier for the rich and the famous to come to her home. And how many people can get their own train stations built? And one of the more impressive additions to the property itself, and one of the most important from a ghost hunting perspective, was a personal theatre, her very own opera house, which allowed her to perform to up to 150 guests. The capacity is a bit smaller now because at the time she had a balcony high up where the servants could stand and look down on the performance. Sadly, that's long gone, but the opera house itself is now a Grade 1 listed building. But if you do look upwards as you walk in nowadays, you can see where that balcony would have once been, and you can also see dotted around the upper part of the theatre the names of the great composers that inspired Patti: Wagner, Mozart, Verdi, and the most important, Rossini. And on the stage itself is a very distinctive backdrop. That's the big curtain-like thing you see hanging at the back of the stage. And what I'll do, I'm describing a lot of scenes here that it might be nice for you to see images of as well. So all of the places I'm talking about on this episode, I'll upload the images to my Facebook page the day this episode goes out. So if you aren't following me already, follow my Facebook page, or at the very least, have a quick look at these images. and it will help put this entire episode into a bit more context. But back to this backdrop on the stage. And what it shows us is a woman with long dark hair and a flowing white robe riding a chariot being pulled by two white horses. But this isn't any old woman. This is a portrait of Adelina Patti herself, and she is riding the chariot of Semi-Ramade. And that is the title role in an opera composed by Rossini specifically for Patti. He wrote this opera with her in mind, and while it might not be as well known today as The Barber of Seville, say, nevertheless, for Patti, this was her at the peak of her powers. This is how she wanted people to remember her. She wanted us to remember her like. At her proudest moment, which means as soon as you walk into this space, you will see Patti directly in front of you. Maybe her ghost is floating around as well, but certainly her image is there in front of you on the stage. This is how she wants us to remember her, and if the reports of paranormal activity are to be believed, I think this is key to understanding what may or may not be going on at Craig-y-Nos. And while I've spent this time describing the stage itself, where things get really spooky is below the stage. Because one of the cutting-edge features of this opera house, again introduced by Patti, is the mechanical floor that can be lowered and slanted as needed. This was an invention in the 19th century popularised by Richard Wagner, who wanted to hide the orchestra from the public. Before this time, you could see the orchestra, there they were in front of you. But Wagner wanted to immerse people in the experience, and if you couldn't see the people playing the music, you were more swept up in the emotion. And so the orchestra are hidden away in the orchestra pit, as we now call it. But the added advantage of this is that if there's no orchestra there, you can put a floor on top of it and use that space for whatever you want to use it for. Shakespeare pantomime, it's an extra bit of stage space. And Patti was one of the first people in the world to install one of these stages that could be tilted and raised and lowered as needed. And nowadays you can still go underneath. And the easiest way to do that is by going backstage. So you walk out of the theatre and then back in the next door on the left that leads backstage and then down into the darkness. Now, I had my first overnight investigation at Craig-y-Nos some 15 years ago now, and even before that, this area had a reputation. People spoke about a staggering amount of activity that was reported both backstage and down underneath the orchestra pit, this darkened area out of sight from the stage itself. People spoke about objects being thrown around, sounds were recorded, people didn't use technical terms like EVP so much back then, it was just spooky sounds, but there were sounds and voices recorded, and icy blasts, and that's one I can confirm myself. That sensation of an icy blast of cold air hitting you as you enter the space. Basically, this area is just a checklist of all the classic signs of a haunted house. You've got the cold air, you've got the strange sounds, and you've got things being thrown around, but in a relatively confined space. Also, and I don't know which came first, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, but it's also said to be the best place to try and make contact with Patti. If that's your intention, to have a chat with Patti, this is the place to do it. However, before I get into that in any more detail, there is something I'd like to clarify, because I did touch upon this at the start, that Patti is blamed for all of this activity, but I think there could be an element of people just associating activity with the most famous person attached to the house. But after Patti died, it wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. This place wasn't empty. In fact, it became overpopulated with people right at the start and right at the end of their lives in some quite tragic circumstances. In fact, between 1922 and 1947, it became a tuberculosis ward, a TB ward for very sick children, which I'm sure you can imagine had a totally different atmosphere to those party times when Patti was there. Instead of champagne and royalty, the rooms were lined with beds, bed after bed after bed, each one for a child with a life-threatening disease. This is a place of unimaginable suffering. And if that wasn't enough, afterwards, after 1947, it became the opposite. Instead of a place for children, it became a hospital for the elderly. And between 1959 and 1986, we go from one extreme to the other, from people at the start of their lives struck down with this horrific disease, to people at the end of their lives who presumably will see out what time they have left in this place. This reminds us that Patti definitely was not the only person to pass away in this estate. And I think it's an important reminder as well to be a little bit sensitive in situations like this. Because regardless of your own personal beliefs, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, this isn't just somewhere to run around trying to scare your friends with stories of a dead opera singer. There is much more recent history here that I think needs to be treated with a bit of sensitivity. That being said, it's also worth remembering, and I'm guilty of this myself, Craig-y-Nos is a huge place. We use the word castle, but really this is an estate. There are different buildings, and some of them do seem to have some direct link with Patti, like the theatre, specifically down below where people try to make contact with her, and they do so. The most popular way of trying to make contact with Patti has been to play her trademark song, Home Sweet Home. Now, this song was written by an American jack of all trades. He did a little bit of everything, poetry, writing, and opera writing, of course, and that was John Howard Payne. And he wrote this song, Home Sweet Home, for an opera that I imagine most people have not heard of or seen, and that was Clary, C-L-A-R-I, in 1823. Now, this song was a favourite of Abraham Lincoln's. As mentioned, he invited Patti to sing it for him soon after his son Willie died, which must have been quite an emotional, powerful moment. And as a result, that song became synonymous with Patti and remains so to this day. And if you're wondering what that song sounds like, if you listen closely to the end of this episode, you might hear Patti herself singing it. Because, luckily for us, sound recording was invented during Patti's lifetime. And before she died, she was convinced into recording some of her songs, including this one, at Craig-y-Nos. So not only did she record this song, she recorded it in Craig-y-Nos. And this is the music that people use to try and make contact with her today by playing her songs, specifically her most famous song, Home Sweet Home, in that theatre area, and especially in the dark down below in the orchestra pit, and it is something I've done myself. And what's interesting is that playing this music does seem to elicit some kind of response. I'm not necessarily saying Patti is floating around in the air, but if you believe in such things, it does seem to work. It is quite uncanny. However, the response it elicits, more often than not, is not a pleasant one. If you are hoping that Patti might just turn up and sing along as well, have a sing-song with you, sadly, it's a much more angry, poltergeist-like response, things being thrown around the room and loud banging and smashing noises. And some of you might remember, some of you with long, long memories, a couple of decades ago now, the television series Most Haunted recorded an episode in Craig-y-Nos. And last year, I was invited on as a guest on Yvette Fielding's podcast. Yvette, the presenter from Most Haunted. Some of you might have heard it. If not, here's a shameless plug. Go and listen to it. But it was lovely to catch up with Yvette. And, of course, we spoke about Craig-y-Nos. And one of the things that came up in conversation, which I don't think many people realise, and you wouldn't unless you've gone reading obscure old biographies of Adelina Patti, which most people wouldn't. I have, but I appreciate most people have lives. But if you haven't read these books, you might assume that by playing this music, by playing Home Sweet Home, you will in some way endear yourself to Patti. This will please her. She might like hearing her music again after all these years. However, it might be the total opposite. What if, in fact, she hates hearing this song like she did in life? Or sorry, just to clarify, she loved the song, she hated the recording. And the reason for that is by the time the technology was invented to record voices, she had retired from opera. Those big performances, those days were behind her. She was no longer that young superstar riding the chariot of Semi-Ramade. She was in her 60s, retired in Craig-y-Nos. But the record companies knew there was a lot of money to be made from recordings of Patti, so they dangled that carrot in front of her and they convinced her to record some of her music. And while Patti made it as difficult as possible for them, she wouldn't go to the studios. If you want to record me, you come to my house. And they did it. They bent over backwards and they recorded it. And when she first heard those recordings, bear in mind, this is an age when people didn't hear their voice ever. And like most people out there, I'm sure, I hate hearing my voice. Nothing pains me more than editing this podcast and having to listen to myself back. Maybe that's why the editing is so shoddy at times. But this is the first time Patti, who'd spent her entire life having people tell her how great she is over and over and over again, and the first opportunity she gets to hear her voice played back to her is in her 60s, and she is absolutely devastated. She is crushed by this. She is still a great singer, but she is no longer the singer who was packing out the opera houses in Paris and Milan, and she never wants to hear that voice again. Which is why, if indeed she continues to float around Craig-y-Nos today in some way, and strangers keep turning up at her house, tormenting her with these old recordings, is it any surprise that maybe, just maybe, she reacts a little bit angrily? Now, it isn't all negative. There are some nicer stories concerning Patti, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there are some nice anecdotes that come to us from musicians rather than ghost hunters. Maybe these musicians are more on Patti's level. Such as the story of a pianist. There was a piano player staying at Craig-y-Nos, and while he was there, he felt compelled to play this melody. This melody came to him, and he sat down and played it without realizing the song he was playing was, you guessed it, Home Sweet Home. He had never heard it before, but something in that house compelled him to play it on the piano. So maybe Patti did want to hear the song, just not her version of the song. And other concerns a hugely successful soprano who was at Craig-y-Nos to record a CD. Remember those? That's compact discs for my younger listeners. She was there to record a CD, and she would turn up early every morning to rehearse. And on one occasion, she could hear, to quote, beautiful dulcet tones wafting around the theatre. Now, she assumed it was her producer playing back and listening to some recordings she had made. But on the way to the editing room, she discovered it was empty. Nobody else had arrived for the day. She was there alone. But this sound seemed to emanate from the theatre. But as she made her way back there, she entered through the stage door, and with that, the singing stopped instantly. And when her producer did eventually show his face, he found her, to quote again, white as a sheet and gibbering about dead opera stars. Which is a pretty good description of this podcast so far. Here's me gibbering about dead opera stars. And while I mentioned this was a place of much death after Patti's time, she isn't the only opera-related person said to haunt Craig-y-Nos. She had a huge extended entourage of people. And if it's a noticeably male haunting, maybe a male figure is seen, the natural culprit then is Ernesto Niccolini, her second husband, the French tenor who was keeping all the gossip columns busy back in the Victorian age. And the other one, which personally I find to be very, very, very unlikely, but he has been connected, and that is the Italian composer Rossini. who, while he was incredibly close to Patti, he wrote an opera for her, as mentioned. So he must have quite liked her. But as far as I can work out, and I have looked into this, not only did Rossini never visit Craig-y-Nos, he never set foot in Wales. He was never in the entire country. And I would love to be proven wrong on that. If anyone does know of Rossini visit in Wales, please let me know. But on the face of it, this looks like a very long-distance haunting, because Rossini is buried in Paris, which incidentally is also where Patti is buried, because she wanted to be buried near her great friend Rossini. So there is a strong connection between the two people, but there's no real connection between Rossini and Wales or the Swansea Valley. Incidentally, if we're talking about spooky stories and composers visit in Wales, there's another slightly unlikely story, which maybe I'll tell you some other day, that involves Richard Wagner and Liszt, actually, the two of them, Wagner and Liszt, looking for eternal life in Aberystwyth. As you do, if I was looking for eternal life, I'd also start in Aberystwyth. But like I said, that's a story for another day. Now, let's move on to some of my personal recollections and experiences from Craig-y-Nos, because there has been quite a few visits over the years. And just to clarify, none of them involve the rooms that people stay in. So places like the theatre, the old TB ward, the stable buildings, I think they are, that are outside, and the countryside itself, of course, it gets pretty dark out there after the shades of night have fallen. Those are the places I've been focused on. But the actual rooms where people sleep in, I have not. So please don't let anything I say on this put you off having a good night's sleep for any reason. Also, the stories that follow, I'm not going to use anyone's names except for one person, because I've spoken about it with him actually on this podcast before. But otherwise, I'm going to avoid giving names. But I remember one person in particular, a total skeptic who had absolutely no interest in hauntings whatsoever, but they came along because it was part of their job. We were there covering it for the press. A lot of these investigations actually I'm talking about were during my time as a journalist. That was my excuse to keep going back to these places, and so there were photographers and editors and people there. But I remember on one occasion this total skeptic came along with us, and it was while we were in that TB ward part of the building that they just disappeared. I mean, they were there with the rest of us 1 second, turn around, and they had gone, as if they'd been whisked off to some other dimension or something. And we assumed either, they just got bored of all this and left, or maybe popped out for a cigarette or whatever, but they were no longer with us. And we kept looking for them as we continued our investigation. And it was about 15 minutes later that we found them sitting in a room on their own, in silence, just sitting there in darkness, staring. It was a bit like the scene at the end of Blair Witch, but instead of standing, they were sitting. And while they wouldn't go into any details, they wouldn't tell us exactly what had happened, whatever had happened seemingly changed their entire world view. Having gone through life thinking it was all a load of rubbish, having gone along on one investigation just as part of their job, the experience had so fundamentally affected them that I am assuming they are still a firm believer to this day, and that is the effect that Craig-y-Nos has on some people. Now, as long-term listeners will know, I am also one of those annoying, skeptical people. I am very open-minded, but nevertheless, I do need convincing evidence before I accept anything at face value. And sadly, while I've had lots of great times and great experiences at Craig-y-Nos, I haven't yet had such a transformative experience myself, but I can tell you of the experiences that did make me think long and hard about what was going on. And I've mentioned how people like to try and make contact with Patti using music. But another way of trying to contact Patti or anyone else who might be in the estate is using a good old Ouija board or similar yes-no letter type answering systems, which I appreciate is far from foolproof, but there have been some very interesting experiments that I've been a part of. And the most effective approach seems to be to use a glass on a table, and I have seen glasses going absolutely bonkers. And again, to stress, I know this isn't foolproof, but when you trust every single person around the table and that glass is going so quickly, it looks like it's going to not just fly off the table, but through the window and off into space, it does give you pause for thought. Now, another popular reoccurring phenomena is faces in windows. Seeing faces in windows. This is a very popular sight, and this, to me, I'll be honest, is less convincing. It's so easy to catch reflections, especially in low lighting, especially with high expectations. And on so many of these investigations, they're almost set up to create a spooky environment. So if a room is lit by candlelight, then you can't be surprised if you get some spooky reflections in the window because you're using candlelight. If you want to eliminate that, you need to eliminate all these spooky special effects that are around. But nevertheless, it's worth mentioning that faces in windows or figures or objects in windows seems to be a reoccurring theme. And again, I have friends and witnesses who would swear blind they have seen such things. And while there might be a little bit of disagreement about whether this was real or not, people swear they've seen it, other people might say, well, was it the light? There was one occasion, one investigation, where I do think there was an element of trickery taking place. And going back to one of these times when we were sitting in that theatre area listening to Patti sing Home Sweet Home, we had some very, very impressive responses. So impressive, in fact, I believe they were fabricated. And I should stress at this point, not by anyone connected to Craig-y-Nos in any way, shape or form. This is somebody we had brought along with us, and the lesson here is always do these things with somebody you trust. But as we were there listening, objects, quite heavy-ish objects, did start falling from above us. And there's a small but important distinction here. When I say they were falling on us, we were being told they were being thrown at us. But there's a definite difference between something being thrown at you and dropped on you. And I am convinced these were falling directly downwards. And directly above us were wooden support beams, which these things could have been balanced on. And by nudging the beam at the other end of the room, you could have tipped these things off at the other end. So maybe I'm being too suspicious, too Mr. Skeptical, but I think on that occasion somebody was trying to elicit a response, and it wasn't the ghost of Adelina Patti. And just to clarify, that is purely my hypothesis. I have zero evidence any trickery did take place. It might have been 100% genuine paranormal, but you do have to look for ways in which this could have been done by a human, and I did find ways in which a human might well have done it had they chosen so. Whether or not they did, I guess we'll never find out. But after such a skeptical downer, we have now reached the point where I'm going to talk about my favourite experiences that I could not explain away. My favourite experiences that you might say are most likely to be paranormal. And this is a story in two parts because it does involve two separate visits. And this is a story that if you have listened to every episode, you will have heard before, because I spoke about this with my good friend Chris Carr on a Christmas special a few years ago. Hopefully that was so long ago, if you did hear it, you've forgotten it by now. Also, I did speak about this with Yvette Fielding, so if you have listened to that episode, again, you will have heard this. And also, if you've been to any of my live events ever, there's a very, very, very good chance at some point somebody will ask about my favourite experiences, and this one does crop up. So basically, if you have heard this once or twice or three times before, I hope you don't mind. I hope you'll enjoy hearing it one more time. And it was on one of my first visits, well, my first actual proper investigation, I think, but one of my earliest visits to Craig-y-Nos. And it was down in that theatre area where we were conducting those experiments. And on this particular occasion, I was there with a group of friends. We were working on a magazine together, doing a Halloween special story. And one of the experiments we carried out down beneath that stage was scrying, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with scrying. But if not, in this case, we were using it in an attempt to get a spirit to materialize on our face in some way by staring into the mirror, and the hope was somebody else's face, a spirit's face, would materialize and stare back at us. And it was a wonderful night. I think that was the night I caught the Craig-y-Nos bug. But I remember one of my friends, a woman I worked with, sitting there staring into the mirror, and I was standing behind one shoulder, and another friend, a male friend this time, was standing behind the other shoulder. All three of us looking into the mirror. And as we watched her face, we could see, and I kid you not, we could see a moustache growing on her face. And I promise you, she did not have a moustache to begin with. And this moustache started growing. And I can remember looking at my friend, and he looked at me with an expression that, as if to say, yes, we can both see a moustache growing on her face. And then we looked back at her face, and you could see her eyes were quite wide in a kind of, what the heck is going on? Why am I growing a moustache? And it grew into what looked more like a full beard. And then all of a sudden, I guess she just couldn't take anymore. Maybe she freaked out seeing this beard and moustache growing. But she jumped up, and with that, the spell was broken. It disappeared and did not come back. But for that brief moment, for those brief seconds, I was watching what looked like something I could not for the life of me explain. But nevertheless, as I said, boring old skeptic, it was a dark room. It could have been down to lighting. It could have been down to so many other things. But the fact that all three of us together saw this is what lends this more weight to me. And also, if you were going to invent something like this, if you were going to invent a haunting, it would be much more exciting. People screaming, objects being thrown about, maybe dropping from a wooden bar above you. You wouldn't invent a woman growing a moustache in a mirror, and a beard, of course. Now, that's the first half of the story, and while I like that, what really, really brings it all together for me is that I was back in Craig-y-Nos 5 years later with my good friend Chris Cara, again, who appeared on a Christmas episode a few years ago. And me and Chris were there for totally unspooky reasons. We were filming a short documentary about the arts, specifically about opera. As mentioned, this is a wonderfully artistic place, and there's as many artistic treasures as there are ghosts there. We were there filming about its operatic history, and we went downstairs to see that orchestra pit. Now, it's very, very dark down there, and the crew that we had filming us had to set up these big, huge lights to illuminate the room. If you've seen live TV being filmed, you might have seen those big, tall lights on tripods that point down on people. We had a couple of those down there pointing at me and Chris to light us up. And the director shouted action or go or whatever words we used. And I remember saying to Chris at that moment, you do realise we are standing in the most haunted part of Craig-y-Nos right now. Because, as you've heard on this episode, this is supposedly the most haunted part of the building. It's where people try to make contact with Patti. This is where the poltergeist activity is reported. This is where objects are thrown around, where icy blasts are experienced. Some people get audible phenomena. And this is where 5 years earlier, I'd watched a woman grow a beard and a moustache in a mirror. And so I said to Chris, this is the most haunted part of Craig-y-Nos. And as I did so, those light bulbs illuminating us exploded and we were cast into total darkness. Now, again, it's quite easy to be Mr. Skeptic afterwards. You can look back and say, well, maybe it was the dodgy electrics, maybe it wasn't fused properly in some way, maybe we overloaded it, which isn't a bad hypothesis, that might well have happened. But at the time, to be talking about how haunted that room was, and for bulbs to explode and to be cast into darkness, well, it stuck with me. It burned itself into my memory. And that is why that is the story I tell people whenever anyone asks me about my favourite, potentially paranormal experience. And that is why, when planning this 5th anniversary episode, I decided Craig-y-Nos would be the perfect topic. And that story, I think, is the perfect way to wrap up this episode. And before I leave you, I did mention I had some news and some quick updates I wanted to share. But of course, first and foremost, a huge thank you, a huge diolch yn fawr iawn to everyone who has joined me for this journey. I have no idea why there are thousands of people around the world listening to this rubbish, but I'm very, very grateful that you are. Whether you are a new convert, whether this is your first episode, or whether you were with me right from the start, right from episode 1, back when I had no idea what I was doing, so nothing much has changed in that respect. But whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you for your support. I've mentioned again and again, it blows my brain that for such a niche subject as the ghosts and folklore of Wales, to have so many people around the world listening is incredible. It's also incredible to meet people in person occasionally. People visiting Wales. I've had some wonderful presents, some wonderful coffees over the years, which leads me to my second piece of news for my American friends, because I did mention all those years ago in those early episodes how much I wanted to be spending Halloween in New England. I wanted to go leaf peeping, although I didn't say that at the time because that's a technical term I was taught by a listener from New England. I had no idea it was so big it was given its own name. So I really want to go leaf peeping and, of course, do all those spooky tourist type things like going to Salem and going to Salem, really. That was pretty much top of my list. Now, when I said those words, it was during COVID. That's why I started this podcast. I was sitting in the house in lockdown. And of course, very few of us could travel back then. Never mind traveling to New England. I couldn't travel to Old England. I couldn't even travel down the road. However, things have changed, and this year I have been invited to America for a few weeks in the autumn. So this September/October, I will be in the United States of America, which I am very, very, very much looking forward to. However, it is not New England on this trip. Hopefully, I'll be able to do New England next year. Maybe if I keep saying it long enough, one day it will eventually happen. But on this trip, and I'm still waiting for the details to be finalized, so I'll know exactly a bit closer to the time. But this trip, if the stars align, if my plane arrives on time, I will be starting my American journey in the Mothman Festival. Yes, the Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. That will be my first stop before heading up to Ohio, and then we'll see what happens from there. More details as I get them closer to autumn. Let's enjoy the summer first. But if you are in that part of the world, if you are heading to the Mothman Festival, then hopefully I'll see you then, if by any chance you are involved in the Mothman Festival. I know there's loads and loads of great stalls and costumes and events and all the rest of it, and I will be making a video. So if you are going to be there, let me know. I will try my best to say hello, or maybe if you've been in the past, maybe you've got some words of advice on the best way to travel there, because it does look pretty hectic getting over the bridge during the festival. Which brings me to my next point. Not very neatly, there isn't much of a link between Mothman and my next point, but anyway, the next point, I have finally gotten around to recording some introduction episodes for this podcast. I've recorded a new 5-minute introduction to explain who I am and what this podcast is about, and an even shorter version, a 60-second version, because by all accounts that's what Spotify and places like nowadays. So if you are relatively new, or even if you're not new and you're just curious to listen to these 5-minute and 1-minute introductions, you can find them right at the very start of this podcast, so before episode 1. So if you go to the list of episodes and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you will find a new episode 0 there. It's just 5 minutes of me explaining who I am and why you should listen to this podcast. And then there's the 1-minute version for people who really have zero attention span, I guess, which of course is not you, because you're still listening to this podcast now as we near the bitter end. Also, I mentioned on last episode, maybe the episode before that as well, that I was aiming to record a Q&A episode for the 5th anniversary. In a way, it kind of became this episode, because as explained, questions like, what are your favourite spooky experiences and variations of that all come together in Craig-y-Nos, and I hope I've answered several of them with this episode. However, there are some really cool questions left that I haven't answered, so I will definitely be recording that. There is a very good chance that will be the next episode. If not, it will be very soon afterwards. So if you didn't send any questions in on time and you would like to, again, you're more than welcome to. The deadline has been extended in a way now that I'm making 2 episodes out of it instead of 1, and you can track me down in all the usual places, either via my website by email or on social media. I'm on all the major platforms, as you know, including, of course, Facebook, where I will post all those photos of Craig-y-Nos ready for when this episode goes out. And the final update I think I wanted to give on this episode is about my books, because again, as regular listeners will know, I do like to shamelessly plug my books when I've got a new book out, but I think 2025 might be the first year where I don't have a brand new book out. One of my older books, The Little Book of Welsh Landmarks, was republished. A new edition was republished earlier this year. And I have written my next 2 books. They're finished and they're with the publisher. But for long, boring reasons, the first one of those isn't going to be published now until early 2026. And the second one, well, your guess is as good as mine. But certainly it looks like there won't be a brand new book out this year. My next entirely new book is going to be 2026. I did have a new edition of one book out earlier though, and of course if you haven't picked up the older ones, they're still lovely, they're still timeless, and they are available from all good bookshops offline and on. All of which brings me to the end of this fifth anniversary episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast going forward, as always, you can treat me to a coffee on Ko-fi via my website, which is always very, very much appreciated. Or, of course, you can support the podcast for absolutely nothing just by giving it a quick like or a thumbs up or leaving a nice review, whatever the options are on whatever platform you are consuming this. And thank you once more for joining me for the last 5 years. Here's to the next 5 years. Who knows what this podcast might sound like on its 10-year anniversary? Well, probably just as chaotic as it does today. Thank you for listening. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, keep listening very, very carefully, because you never know when Adelina Patti might start to sing. Until next time, Nosta.